Hi guys, Nomus here. Welcome back to Northam City for episode number 14. So last time I built a pretty big and complicated metro station at different levels crossing over each other. And I'll be starting to build out the neighborhood around it in this video. But before I do that, I have some infrastructure to take care of, specifically related to highways and the metro network. I'll connect the highway onto the street network on both sides of the river around here, so that they can both access the Astoria Bridge. To start off, I'm building a wide street directly under the elevated highway. This will be what connects the highway into the street grid. For an interchange, it will be pretty simple, just simply connecting two on-ramps and two off-ramps directly into this wide street, trying to get a good slope, or gradient as it's called. Something else I do here is trying to get more realism for the support of the highway. Using IMT on the wide street below, I'm putting in some concrete pillars, which straddle across the street, with pillars on each side of it, with one central horizontal pillar stretching across. There is some tinkering going with the different values in IMT, but I think the end result is pretty good, and you can see some of this here in the video. Before I'm doing the interchange across the river in the Manhattan district, I need to extend the street grid a bit. You can probably tell by the name that this district will be mainly inspired by Manhattan. I think I mentioned this before in the Central Station episode. So it will be the oldest part of the city, and originally this island was the entire city, while the other boroughs were separate cities, which got incorporated into what we today know as Northam City. Apart from the avenues and one-way streets crossing them, I'm also building a diagonal road which cuts right through the street grid. This might look similar to Broadway in New York, and I will actually call this street Broadway as well. It follows the same angle of a rail line which dips in the ground on the northern part of the island. This was actually an old trade route from before the island got developed and colonized, and was the first ever street here, meaning that the rail line actually followed along it and not the other way around. Later on, in the history of Manhattan, the rigid street grid was built around it. Broadway is a street that the interchange will connect into, I'm going for something a bit more complex for this interchange. I also try to not to take up too much space, as we're in a very dense urban area here, and there will be some pretty tight workarounds. So the idea is that I pull out a two-way ramp on two ends of the elevated highway going into Broadway, which will be the connecting point of the highway in each direction. To make this work, I need to figure out a way to bend and loop the elevated ramps going on and off the highway. This is to try and not take up too much space, while still having an acceptable gradient. Even in an urban area with limited space, I try to keep at a maximum of around 6 to 7% gradient, and this is actually taken from official guidelines for highways in the USA. I mess up directions here and there along the way. I need to delete and redo the ramps along the way. And it gets pretty challenging when I'm also working around an elevated rail line which slopes down to street level right next to the highway. I do think the end result looks pretty interesting though. I'm no expert in highway and I never will be, but I always try to make it as realistic and interesting as I can. I'm adding in some basic directions like the lines and chevrons, where the highway merges, and some highway signs, just to have some basic details. Something I also did on the previous interchange. When this is built, there's connections in both the West Island, which consists of Oakland and Astoria, and Manhattan, to the road bridge called Astoria Bridge.
Always had a way to make it work and find another route. Always had a way to make it work and find another route. Always had a way to make it work and find another route. Always had a way to make it work and find another route.
And this is a bridge called Astoria Bridge, named after the borough it's connecting to. It is just a simple metal truss bridge. I found a pretty fitting truss bridge asset on the workshop. The texture wasn't quite what I imagined, so I converted it to a procedural object, meaning I can change the texture. This also meant I could stretch it to fit perfectly around the roads going across the bridge. Next up, I'm extending the metro network, specifically the quad-tracked elevated line carrying the 2 and 3 train, also called Kane Boulevard elevated metro line, across the river into Manhattan. I found a really nice truss bridge asset to go around the tracks for this bridge, which I converted into a procedural object and stretched it to fit. I also colored it green, as I found that was a fitting color here. And this bridge will be called the Kane Boulevard Bridge, named after the Kane Boulevard line, as the elevated metro line follows this street for its entirety through Oakland and Astoria. To give the bridge some extra use, I stretched an elevated deck on each side of the bridge. One side will be for bikes, while the other side will be for pedestrians. This is something you see on loads of different bridges in New York, among other cities probably. To give it that old school look, I use IMT to give both decks a wooden surface, and support them with some old looking metal pillars on their approach to the bridge. To make the elevated tracks go perfectly centered above the streets, I used a parallel tool set to 0 meter offset, and then I raise it up to 9 meters above. It's going to follow an avenue north-south before it goes off and turns to go across the island, going right past the southern end of the central station. This will mean it can have stations right in the middle of the Midtown business district, and be close to a lot of the intercity, regional and suburban train lines from the central station. These are the old school green metal pillars from the tracks I'm using that I converted to PO so I can stretch them up a bit so they don't interfere and clip with anything going on underground. Because as you probably know, I'm doing a lot of detailing underground as well, and I don't want these pillars to stick through anything going on around there. As you can see here, I'm making sure to place them with about 50 meters between them. But this is a pretty normal distance between pillars for elevated rail lines. And now I'm finally back to the area around the station. I know I said I was going to start building the neighborhood around, but I got one more thing to do first. The station was supposed to be finished in the last episode, but I'm making a little extension to it, with some underground lines. Cutting across the station diagonally underground is a quad-tracked station, which connects into a quad-tracked underground line. This line will carry the E-train, which is split into two services, local and express trains, meaning they will share the same corridor for their entirety, but only the local train will make all stops. This will actually be one of the few metro lines that doesn't go through Manhattan, but we'll see in the future exactly where it's gonna go. To include this new part of the station, I'm making some changes to the main entrances. With the big underground entrance, I'm encasing it in some brick walls and a dark roof, using PO. This is somewhat inspired by the Broadway Junction, but scaled down quite a bit. I of course need to also make changes to all the wayfinding signs to include the new underground lines. And I'm adding some basic details to the underground platforms with line information signs and wayfinding signs by the exit stairs and elevators. Just to get the line started, I'm building out a little stretch of it and placing down another station a bit north. This will be a local station, which the express trains will be skipping. Now I'm actually starting to build a neighborhood, and the first thing I'm doing will be to build a high school right next to the station. This is, as you can see, a brutalist style high school, which I imagine was built sometime in the 70s to accommodate the growing population in the area. What I'm doing is just merging together 4 Plattenbau schools into a squared complex with some open space in the middle for hanging out between classes. Next to it I'm building out a little skate park, and this is inspired by what's next to Broadway Junction Station, which inspired the station that I built there. But the neighborhood around is not inspired by the neighborhood that Broadway Junction sits in. It's gonna be quite different. Across the road I'm putting some sports courts and a few moderately modern brick apartment towers. And while I continue to build, it's a good time to talk a bit about what this neighborhood is and the inspirations. The neighborhood is called Brasswood, and the story is that it had a lot of industry in early years of the city. But at some point all the factories started to close down, and it became a bit of an undesirable and deserted area. At some point a lot of artists started moving in here because of cheap rent, and it transformed into a hip neighborhood with time. The main inspiration for this will be hip neighborhoods around Brooklyn with similar stories, primarily Williamsburg, which is kind of like hipster central from my understanding. So it's going to be a sprawl of mid-density with just 4 to 5 story wall-to-wall apartment buildings with businesses in the ground floor along tree-lined streets. And this is what a lot of Williamsburgs look like, and basically Brooklyn in general. Another very important part of the neighborhood is the numerous closed down factories which has been turned into other uses. Some might have been turned into apartment buildings with trendy loft apartments. Some might have been turned into bars, restaurants, nightclubs, coffee shops or small local breweries or art galleries. And there will also be some modern additions with hotels and apartment towers. I imagine there were some factories which closed down and just got demolished to make place for some modern buildings. Along this street right by the highway, I wanted to change it up a bit with some light industrial buildings, just to have that look of some small industrial businesses still left in the neighborhood. And next to them are some pretty modest and halfway sketchy looking apartment buildings. And then I'll fill out with some more apartments and shops. There's gonna be some repetition in filling out a lot of the city blocks, so I'll skip past plenty of it and focus on the main detail builds around the neighborhood. What I'm building here is loosely inspired by a hotel that I spotted on Google Earth in Williamsburg. It might be hard to make out here, but it's got the Williamsburg Hotel written down the side of the building. It's also got a pretty nice rooftop area with a small pool and some other stuff, which I'll be doing as well. So how do I do this in game? I'm using some really nice mid-rise corner apartment buildings side to side to make one whole building. And then I'm taking a pool asset which I raise up to the height of the roof. There's not really enough space on the back of the buildings for the rooftop area that I want. so I need to extend the hotel building in some way. What I do is I make a copy of the building and convert it to PO. Then I stretch the vertices to make an extension of the building at the back. It created some glitchy areas at the top, but I use a PO cube with brick textures to cover this up. But before I do this and detail the rooftop, I'm going to do the name down the side of the building. And this will be the Brasswood Hotel. For the letters, I'm using these really cool letter props, which has bulbs inside them so that they light up at night, which I think adds a lot of coolness and add detail. After doing the extension with PO that I talked about and adding some details at the entrance, I'll go on to detail the rooftop. There's a lot of different details that I use to make this rooftop really come alive, and I'll try to sum them up before you can see them unfold on screen. For the roof I use a PO surface, with for the floors on the rooftop I use a PO surface with a wood texture, as I thought this was the best fit there. Down at ground level I create a little scene for an auto bar, which I then rise up to the rooftop. Around the pool I got a bunch of Sims in their swimwear, chilling in sunbeds, and then I covered the rest of the rooftop with a bunch of table groups, plants, and a DJ playing music by the pool, and some lights. Just a lot of different details to make it come alive. Across the street, I'm filling out with some more hotels and a few apartment buildings to fill out this core of the neighborhood. I imagine these 3 factories originally had some production related to metals, which got closed down at some point. Nowadays they have all been turned into pubs, which I'll detail them as by using some pub signs and plenty of outdoor seating. In this block I'm putting down a larger factory which has been turned into apartments, or lofts as they called, and in the alley behind it are some smaller buildings which have these red light district windows at the ground floor. Northam State has legalized prostitution, and Brasswood has one of several red light districts around the city. I'll talk about the detailing of the former factory turned into lofts in a second. First off, I figured this little annex with a lower roof height would make a nice pub, so I'll put in some details to give it that look. After that I move upwards, as I want to give this building a nice rooftop area. The rooftop area is probably mainly for the residents in the building, but I can also bring guests here. I'm using another wooden texture for the floor here, to give it some more variety. I had to raise the pool area up a little bit, and to make that make sense I'm putting some glass fences around that and making a little ramp up to it using the same wooden floors. There's also an outside bar here, and the rooftop has tons of different seating groups. Well, there's no DJ here, just speakers scattered around playing music, probably controlled by a laptop in the bar or something like that using wireless speakers. For this rooftop I wanted to have a little movement, as I had a lot of space. So what I did was draw an invisible path up from street level through the entrance door of the building, and then I placed a raisable park people generator at the open space on the rooftop. What I'm putting here is what used to be the main factory, which historically sat at the heart of the neighborhood. Today it's a large nightclub called the Ironworks, named after its historical use. Well, the nightclub is inside the big main building. The smaller side buildings are smaller pubs, which have a bit more of a relaxed vibe. The Ironworks is one of the most popular music venues in the entire city, and sees concerts from several big artists throughout the whole year, and a lot of DJs get their start here. In front of the entrance, I wanted to get that look you see of really busy nightclubs with huge lines. Often they put up these portable construction fences to guide the queue in a way. First I draw a tiny path as a guide, and then line the fences around it. By the entrance I use some props of men in suits that looks like bouncers, and then a few tourist props at the front to fill that space out. Hoping some Sims will stand around in the queue, I place a lot of park people generators along where the queue is supposed to be. And above the entrance I use a PO cube with brick texture, so I can write the name of the club. Using MT on the street, I try to get some colored lights inside the windows to give it that final touch. It wouldn't be a hip neighborhood without these monstrous modern mixed-use high-rises springing up, which gets people to yell gentrification. This was probably a lot for a factory which didn't make it and got demolished for new buildings to go up, something that we'll see other places in the neighborhood as well. Looking at Google Earth for inspiration, I noticed this large building with a dome roof close to the highway in Williamsburg. I thought it looked like a church and I got this asset which was fitting. But it's not a church, I'll get back to what it actually is later on. In this empty place behind the city block, bordering the highway, I thought some unmarked parking spots would look cool. And to rough it up, I used tons of damage and stain decals along with tons of trash. To get some more schools in with a wall-to-wall city block style, I'm using these Georgian Miller assets which I converted into high school and elementary schools inside the asset editor. And I'm adding a synagogue as well in the block, because I imagine there's a big Jewish population in this area. When I looked closer at the inspiration, I noticed that the building had some writing on it, saying Williamsburg Savings Bank. So this will be the Brasswood Savings Bank. I modified some of the urban roads in the asset editor to give them bike lanes, and then I made an IMT preset. So here I'm just extending the corridor of bike lanes, which will span a long way through the borough. This street right here, which has most of the old factories on it, is a quite historical street and is called Ironworks Lane. I wanted it to look different than the rest and point to its interesting history and significance. So this will be one of the few remaining cobblestone streets in Northam City. And an extra touch will be adding these rails into the street, which remains from when trains with cargo used to run right down the street there, servicing the numerous factories. Because this is a hip and artistic neighborhood, I wanted to add lots of murals. It really does add a lot to the overall look. Anyways, that is it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it if you made it this far. A like, comment and subscribe would be greatly appreciated and help me grow the channel. I also do have a Patreon in case you'd wish to support me further. Have a great rest of your day, hope to see you in the next one, and stay tuned for some cinematics of the first part of the neighborhood called Brasswood.